everyone here. We're glad to have everyone here tonight. We have people joining us on Facebook, as well as our regular members are joining us on Zoom. And tonight we have with us Jim Knoll and Terry Lappin, who will be managing the technology and also handling Facebook. We ask that people who are attending via Zoom to please, when you have questions or comments during the presentation or afterwards, that you place those in the chat, and we will ask those, but they may come at the end of the presentation. And we will also ask our Facebook people to please type in your questions for us, and we will make sure and get all of your questions as well. But again, they may not come at the moment of the presentation unless there's something that you perhaps didn't understand about what the speaker said, or something that's a pretty momentary thing. We'll try to catch those soon, but the rest will delay to the end and have a question and answer period for the speaker. Some of you may be noting that Jim and Terry tonight are working in the Stewart Observatory auditorium, where we normally would have our meetings if we were meeting in person, and they are just kind of practicing interfacing with the system there tonight. So we tonight also, I want to remind you to please mute yourselves if you are attending via Zoom during the speaker presentation, because we can pick up background noise. And if you have your video on at any point in the meeting start moving around a lot, then it would probably be helpful to turn the video off until you're able to settle down some, so that it doesn't distract the meeting. Tonight, we were going to have, and we advertised having, two speakers tonight. One who is speaking on light pollution, and then Mary Turner was scheduled tonight to do her quarterly presentation to us of what's up in the sky. And she does this with a great deal of entertainment, and we always enjoy Dr. Turner's presentations. However, her electricity in her whole neighborhood went out this evening, and so she has no electricity to attend with, and so we will postpone her presentation until another time, but we will make sure and try to get it in as soon as we can. Our other presenter tonight is John Barentine, and John, as many of you know, worked for years for the International Dark Sky Association, and now is running his own consulting business. And we're very happy to have John here with us tonight to talk about dark skies. So John, are you ready to share your screen?
I am ready, May.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, let me go ahead and do that and start my slides. First of all, I would like to thank the TAAA for inviting me to come speak tonight. It's always an honor. I like to see the Stewart classroom. I was a student in that very room about 25 years ago, so it kind of all comes full circle. And as May said, in my background, I was at the IDA for about 8 years until recently, and have started working, doing this work as a freelancer. And tonight, what I would like to talk to you about is a little bit of everything. I call this presentation Dark Skies in Southern Arizona, Past, Present, and Future. And the idea is I'm going to give you some framing for the problem as we see it with dark skies and light pollution in this region. We'll talk about the past, including the very distant past here in this region, and why dark skies are important to people, up through the challenges that we face in the present and what we think is coming down the road. And over the next about 30 or 35 minutes, since we're going on a little journey together, here's the roadmap. I'm going to start with that big picture information. For many of you, I know you already know a lot of this, but it never hurts to have a little refresher. Then I'll go into a little what I call night history. That's the background in Southern Arizona and why dark skies have been important here. I'll talk more about the sort of the recent past and even the present in the third part of the talk. Then I'll move on to the challenges that we anticipate in this area in the rest of this decade and maybe even into the future beyond that. And then lastly, because this topic has come up quite recently and people are very interested in it, I will describe the emerging threat of satellite light pollution. A lot of people are paying attention to now as every new group of Starlink satellites goes up. So that's how I'll close the talk. So first, the big picture. And I know that again, many of you will already know some of this information, so bear with me, although I want to put a little bit of a twist on it, because I think as astronomers, we tend to filter light pollution through the phenomenon of sky glow. But I want to take a step back and I want to define this term for you, at least the definition that I use, which is not necessarily a definition that everybody agrees with, because we don't have a universal definition for light pollution in this field, but this is one I think a lot of people would agree with. And that is any adverse effect or impact attributable to the use of artificial light at night. And what's important in that definition, as I've written it here, is the notion of an adverse effect, some sort of negative impact. And I want to differentiate the light that is causing light pollution from the kind of light that we know is very useful and in fact necessary to our society. We're living in a time now where artificial light from electric sources has been around for more than a century, and it's become an indispensable part of our lives. So I don't mean to suggest that every emission of light in an outdoor space at night is necessarily light pollution, although it's very easy for it to turn into that. And so what I want to draw attention to here in this definition is this notion of there being something negative about it. There's some excess, there's some waste, there's some impact to the nighttime environment that's caused by all this artificial light at night. So if I use the term light pollution, this is what I'm referring to. Again, as astronomers, we like to think of this mainly in the form of sky glow, which is a symptom of light pollution, but not the thing itself. Keep that in mind. So anytime we talk about a solution to this problem, it would encompass sky glow, but it would have a number of benefits in addition to that. So broadly speaking, then what is light pollution? And to illustrate it, I have a few examples here that will be familiar to basically everybody. Even here in Tucson, where conditions are better than they are in other parts of the United States or in the rest of the world, we still have issues. We have people that are not very aware of the problem. They tend to use light a little carelessly as we might view it. And all of these are examples of where you might encounter light pollution because they have these adverse effects or impacts associated with them. Many of these impacts involve an amount of light that's beyond what is necessary, the overlighting, the example of the auto mall up there at upper right. Light where it's not wanted. So that's the light trespass in the upper left, where you have light in one part of a property shining into the windows of a building, for example. But there can be other effects like what we would call light clutter there in the lower left. And that's if you come into a more densely developed area, and especially if it's an unfamiliar part of a city, for example, or a place you've never been to. And at night, if you have all of these sources of light in your face constantly or simultaneously, it can be disorienting. And it can even be a bit of a public safety detriment if you're trying to navigate through all of this excessive light. And then, of course, there's the issue of glare. And as people age, especially, becomes increasingly acute. Our eyes are not very good at adapting to very rapid changes in light intensity as we get older. And so the example there, everybody's had it, where you come around a curve at night while you're driving, somebody has their bright lights on, and for a few moments, you can't see a thing until hopefully they switch the brights off. These are all forms of light pollution in addition to the sky glow that we normally think about as astronomers. And so in dealing with the problem that's underlying it, we could help solve each of these situations. And again, it comes back to this notion of just being more mindful about how we're using all this light so that we avoid these adverse effects. So what fundamentally causes light pollution? And you've already heard me use this term, which is artificial light at night. That is a catch-all for any kind of light in the nighttime environment that is ultimately caused by humans. So we're differentiating natural sources of light in the environment, the moon, the stars, the Milky Way, natural sources of light on the ground, such as wildfires or lightning, that would probably occur even if there weren't people on the planet. The wildfire part is arguable, but certainly the other sources, bioluminescence, for example, those are all natural forms of light. But really what I'm talking about is human caused light, and more particularly the kind that is ultimately powered by electric sources. So to differentiate the two broad kinds of artificial light at night, or ALAN, if you hear me use that term, I have two pictures here on the right. One of them is the New York City skyline. That's obviously an outdoor setting. We're taking light mainly from indoor locations. You can see the light shining through the windows of the buildings, and we're projecting it into the outdoor environment. So that's the kind of light pollution that we're mainly talking about in this presentation. There is the notion of indoor artificial light at night that's suggested by the person sitting in front of the computer screen late at night. And that seems to have an effect on human health and well-being. And I'm really separating that out because that's an emerging field of study right now. And there's a lot that we do not know, although there are indications that in particular in indoor settings, that exposure to light at night, again, the timing is very important. It's nighttime when our brains and our bodies don't expect it to be there that seems to have problems. But for the rest of this presentation, bear in mind that I'm largely talking about the outdoor form of artificial light at night. So what do we know about all of this light pollution at this point? And these are some facts that come from a paper that was published by Fabio Falchi and coworkers a little more than 5 years ago now, that's called the New World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness. And it's the most comprehensive global look at light pollution that we have to date. That was derived from satellite measurements of the Earth at night. And these are some of the main conclusions from that paper. Now, bear in mind that the data that were used for that paper are now almost a decade old. They cover the span of time from about 2012 to about 2015. So it's a little bit dated, but it's still pretty current. And what stands out to me in some of these facts are just how many people in the world are impacted by this problem. It's upward of 80% of the world population, and in some parts of the world, namely in Western Europe and the United States, it is as high as 90%. And these are situations where, as the last little factoid there suggests, that a vast number of people in both North America and Europe live in places where there's so much light in the nighttime environment that they never achieve an astronomically dark setting at all during the night. The night sky is always brighter than the natural background level. And we use the brightness of the night sky as a proxy for the amount of light that's being put into the nighttime environment in general. And one of our main indicators of the quality of the night sky is the visibility of the Milky Way. And we already know that as of the early 2010s, about a third of people in the world were living in places where they never see the Milky Way. So it really says something about the extent to which this is a truly global problem. It's not just a problem here in Southern Arizona or in the United States, but it's one that is affecting much of the world now. And to drive that point home, I have the same image that's in my Zoom background here on this slide to suggest to you that the use of ALAN, artificial light at night, really is truly global. This is an image that's made up of, it's a composite of many individual satellite images of the Earth that were made over the span of about a year in 2016. And they composited these images together to show the Earth as if it were simultaneously night everywhere at once, and there were no clouds anywhere on Earth, so that we can see all the way down to the land or the water in every place. And so the continents stand out quite well from the oceans because they're illuminated by moonlight in all of these images. But the main takeaway here is the golden color that's outlining many of the continents, which is all of humanity's artificial light at night. And as you can see, with the exception of places like, Siberia and Greenland and Antarctica, there's really an indication of light almost everywhere on this map. And at first you might be tempted to conclude that this is a map that shows where people live. And at sort of a first order level, you would be right about that, because obviously there are a lot of people here in North America and Europe, parts of China, India, et cetera, and fewer people in places like the Australian outback or the Amazon basin of South America. But what this is also telling us is something about the economic development level of humanity. I can guarantee you, for example, that there are about as many people in sub-Saharan Africa as there are in all of India, but that part of Africa does not light up on this map. And that's because a lot of the people who live in that part of the world do not have electricity and therefore don't have artificial light yet. It also says something about our tendency to waste resources, that the fact that the wealthier parts of the world are very brightly lit means that we're able to waste light because for us it's very cheap, whereas people in other parts of the world don't have that luxury. So in addition to this global distribution of light, we can see something about ourselves reflected in the pattern of distribution of light on the surface of the Earth at night. So why is this happening? Well, fundamentally, it comes down to an issue of waste, which is what I've suggested in a couple of the slides so far. We simply use more artificial light at night than we really need for our legitimate needs. A lot of that overuse is coming from wastefulness. Again, as is our economic tradition here, especially in the West, when something becomes very easy to produce, it becomes cheap. And when things become cheap, we tend to consume more of those things than less of them. And the result is a lot of waste. But we think that the wastefulness is resulting from a lack of awareness about the problem, and that if we explain to more people that they can achieve the same outcome in terms of their ability to move about safely at night, to see where they're going, to avoid hazards, to enable a nighttime economy, and we could do it with vastly less light by simply being more mindful about how we're using it, then we wouldn't end up with situations like the foreground image here where the city is lit up, the sides of the buildings are illuminated, and there aren't very many stars in the night sky. And that there is a way that these things can peacefully coexist, where we can reduce this waste. We can bring a little bit of the night sky back to cities. We can reduce our energy consumption and improve our energy security. And do so in a way that's a win-win and really doesn't disadvantage anybody in the process. And why does this matter? Again, many of you may be familiar with this already, but it's certainly a lot more than astronomy, to the point that I didn't even bother to put that on the slide. We already know that there's a significant impact to astronomy here on the ground, but light pollution also touches on all of these other issues that have some pretty significant social implications. Climate change being the least of them. Even though lighting has become very energy efficient in recent years, there's still a lot of it out there that's being wasted. And even as we ramp up our renewable energy sources, light pollution still represents a tremendous amount of waste that could be avoided, and that would reduce our global climate footprint. Crime and traffic safety are things that matter to people. We want to live in safe communities, both in terms of crime as well as the ability to get around at night. Safe streets, safe sidewalks, et cetera. And even here in the city, we have an urban ecology. We have a web of life that's interacting with us as humans, with the life that's inside and outside of our community and the lands beyond. And we know that there are significant ecological impacts to all of this light at night. So the reason why it matters is that this is all tied up together. And if we solve the problem for any one of these reasons, that we ultimately solve them for all of the reasons. And I think that our climate, our planet, our society would benefit if we did that. And that's why we engage in this work ultimately. So now a little history about how dark skies has figured significantly in southern Arizona, and then I'll go from there to sort of the more modern times, and eventually we'll get to what the future holds. Southern Arizona astronomy and sky watching is really an ancient pastime. And for anybody who's lived here long enough, you know that Europeans were not the first people to arrive here, and that there was a human presence in Arizona and in the Southwest at least 10 to 12,000 years in the past. The map on the left shows the distributions of the homelands of the prehistoric peoples who lived in this part of the world. Not long ago, this was the homeland of the Hohokam people, and is still the homeland of the people who are likely their descendants, who are the O'odham people. So if you've ever heard of the Tohono O'odham people who live west of Tucson, they are probably the genetic descendants of those people. So there's this long continuum of occupation in Southern Arizona, again, going at least back 10,000 years ago. And when we look at the material culture that these people left behind, so their ceramics, their rock art, we see a lot of motifs that seem to have to do with the night sky, or in using things like rock art as calendar devices that help to pass or mark the passage of time. Also not shown here, but something that's significant are the alignments of structures with the cardinal directions, or with the rising and setting of sun on important dates like the solstices and the equinoxes. So for these people who were trying to eke out a living in our often incredibly difficult climate in this part of the world, it was crucial that they understand when certain events were going to happen. When was it right to plant the crops and when to harvest them? When would the monsoon come in the summer? And they didn't have phones in their pockets and calendars on their walls that they could mark the passage of time. And so they really depended on having a deep cultural knowledge of the night sky and the daytime sky as well, in order to understand when those things would happen. So this is something that's embedded in the traditions of our part of the world, and has been for a very long time. So fast forward a bit to the European contact in the 16th century here in Southern Arizona. And some of the first Europeans to enter what is now the United States brought with them the astronomy traditions of Europe. And for many people in the Tucson area, I've heard of Father Eusebio Kino, who was one of the first Spanish missionaries to arrive in the latter part of the 17th century. And as it turns out, Father Kino was an astronomer and was trained in astronomy when he was still a Jesuit in Italy, before he ever came to the New World. And the frontispiece of his book that's there just to the left of center shows the writings that he made about the comet of 1680. The book was published shortly after he arrived in Mexico City the following year. And there's an idealized portrait of him on the left. We don't exactly know what he looked like in life, but that's an idealized image of Father Kino using an astrolabe. And talking to some people in the Kino Society, it turns out that it's entirely possible that Father Kino might have brought a small telescope with him when he came to what is now Arizona. We don't have any firsthand accounts of that, but someone with his degree of learning and access to resources may well have had a small Galilean telescope, which might have been the first one here in Arizona. So this is now bringing in the European tradition, the beginning of the scientific tradition into Southern Arizona, and is an important mile marker on our journey through this part of our history. And fast forward a bit now to the 20th century and the founding of Kitt Peak National Observatory, which was the nation's observatory in the late 1950s. I'm sure many of you have been to Kitt Peak, probably many times, but it's worth reminding us of how significant a site this is, even to the modern day, with one of the densest assemblages of telescopes anywhere in the world. And Kitt Peak is still very much doing cutting edge scientific research, even though it's located little more than an hour from one of the bigger metro areas in the country. And so a lot of the interest in protecting dark skies here in Southern Arizona stems from the astronomy enterprise, which involves an incredible investment of money and resources, to the extent that about 15 years ago, people were beginning to refer to astronomy, or to Tucson, as the astronomy capital of the world. By the 1990s, 2000s, we had all of these facilities in and around our city where some of the most important work in astronomy was being done. We still have some of the largest optical telescopes in the world in our area, such as the Large Binocular Telescope on Mount Graham. And as this investment in the infrastructure of astronomy was made for doing professional research, people around here began to realize that this was a significant contributor to our local economy. So in the mid-2000s, through the Eller College at the University of Arizona, some survey work revealed that the impact of astronomy in Arizona on our economy at that time was worth what was referred to as a Super Bowl a year. And by that, I mean that the monetary impact, the spend each year in Arizona for astronomy, planetary and space science was by that time about $250 million a year. And it turned out that that was about the amount that the host city of a Super Bowl could expect to see in revenue from the event. So we were getting this in impact every year here in Arizona. And eventually some of our elected officials began to take note and decided, you know, we better be a little more aggressive in how we protect the dark skies that enable this work to be done. So it's a significant part of our economy and one of the main motivators to this day for why we try to protect the dark sky here. But at the same time, we have significant challenges. And some of these very large cities in the West, places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Los Angeles, are emitting so much light that they're beginning to crowd out our dark skies. What I'm showing you here in this image on the right is a map of Arizona. It's outlined in white and the surrounding states with a set of false colors overlaid that indicate the brightness of the night sky at the zenith. This is something that's called the artificial light ratio. So you measure the brightness of the night sky at the zenith, you compare it to a natural night sky, and however many times more bright that sky is compared to the natural level is this ratio. This map was prepared by the U.S. National Park Service based on satellite data. So they have also overlaid the boundaries of U.S. national parks and monuments in green. So you can see there's a lot of public lands that are preserved here in this area. And the colors for the artificial light ratio range from effectively 1, where the sky is pristine, that's in black, all the way up to bright reds and even pinks or whites in the center of the larger cities. And as those colors get warmer, the sky is getting brighter. As you can see that by the early part of the last decade, the only part of the state where we were still routinely achieving pristine night skies was in parts of Grand Canyon National Park and the adjacent Kaibab Plateau. And that down here in southern Arizona, our pristine skies are already gone. So now we're talking about how can we slow or even reverse the growth of light coming from cities like Phoenix and Tucson so that we can hold the line with what we have and maybe reverse some of the problems a bit. But this is a really big regional land use planning problem that I hope that our elected officials and our experts are going to deal with in the next couple of decades, again, realizing how important this is to our economy. So that brings us up into the last approximately 35 years or so. And dark skies in southern Arizona really began to take off about 50 years ago. And I'm giving as an example here a story that ran in June 1971 in the New York Times in a story that was headlined, "Light Pollution from a Growing Tucson Threatens the Astronomy Capital of the World." This is one of the first instances where the term light pollution appeared in the mass media. Again, this is barely 50 years ago. And it was interesting to me, this pulled quote that I have here about light pollution as being an insidious form of environmental contamination. Remember, this was at the sort of the height of the first wave of the environmental movement here in the US. Not long after that, the Clean Air Act was passed by Congress, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. The first Earth Day had just happened earlier in 1970. And already people were beginning to notice that this was going to be a problem for astronomy. We didn't yet know that it was a problem for all those other reasons that I mentioned earlier that are beyond astronomy. But this is a movement that really is half a century in the making. And Tucson was a real leader in that. In 1988, the International Dark Sky Association was founded right here in Tucson and remains headquartered here. A lot of you probably know or met those fellows over there on the left, Tim Hunter and David Crawford, who were the founders of IDA. And they had in mind from the very beginning that light pollution was not a problem unique to this city or this state or this country, They founded it from the beginning as an international organization to tackle an international problem. And IDA remains the world leader in this realm. It's the recognized authority on the subject of light pollution. And it has maintained a strong presence here in our local community through its Southern Arizona chapter. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that IDA has worked on or contributed to here in the region in recent years and the last couple of decades. Starting off with its conservation initiatives, which is represented through its International Dark Sky Places program, or IDSP. This is a program that I managed for about 5 years when I was working for the organization. And during that time, we brought in the first designations in the program in Southern Arizona, starting with Oracle State Park in 2014. The yellow stars on the map here are the places that have received designations. The silver stars are the ones that have been working on them in recent years and might turn into designations in the future. And like the artificial light ratio map that I showed you earlier, here the colors represent the amount of expected sky glow on the ground. So you'll notice that a lot of these places, especially out west on the reservation, the Cascabel region to the east of the Rincons, are in still pretty dark places. You go to a place like Oracle, and with the screening effect of the Catalinas, you can see the Milky Way quite well from up there. And this is accessible to our metro area now of more than 1 million people for a drive that's less than an hour from the center of town. And so we want to keep these places dark, and IDA is really leading the way in that conservation aspect of the work that they do. And even for the communities that haven't formally sought designation with IDA, there are a lot of very good outdoor lighting policies in our area, from the individual municipalities that I've marked here to the counties themselves. There's a lot of work that's been done to make these really exemplary policies that are helping to contain the light, especially here in Tucson, which shares its lighting ordinance with Pima County. But all of these communities, I think, have drawn some inspiration from the model policies that IDA promotes and the lighting practices that have developed as a result of those policies. So this is really good and important work. We need to be vigilant. You know, there are always people moving into our part of the country that are not from here, and they may not be as sensitized to this issue. So there will always be a little pressure to try to, you know, maybe allow a little bit more light, a few more unshielded lights, that sort of thing. So we will always need to remind people why it's important that we have these policies in order to continue them into the future. Tucson itself, the city, was a fantastic example in its transition to LED street lighting in 2016 and 2017. In order to ensure that this transition did not adversely affect astronomy in the region, Tucson significantly reduced its light emissions during the part of the design process of the project. And that involved an overall reduction in the light emission of our street lighting system by about 63%, in going from the old sodium lighting system that we had for decades before to the new LED lighting system that we have now. And as it turns out, we were able to validate with evidence from the field, both measured on the ground and through satellite measurements, showing that especially in places that are far from Tucson, like the observatory sites at Kitt Peak and Mount Lemmon, Mount Hopkins, et cetera, there was a significant decrease in the brightness of those sites at the zenith by about 10%. That appears to be the result of the street lighting transition. We published these data in 2018. We also saw a corresponding reduction in the amount of light the city itself emits as seen from orbit by orbiting satellites. So by doing this very carefully, reducing the light level in the transition, actively controlling the lights at night, we concluded that the sky glow over Tucson really did decrease during that transition. And now we're promoting this as an example to other municipalities around the country that are also going through this kind of transition right now, in hopes that they will make similarly good decisions. We were fortunate to work with the city of Tucson in using this dimming capability of our new lighting system to do an experiment a couple of years ago, where we deliberately put the street lighting system into different configurations and observed both from the ground and from space. And with that, we were able to determine the fraction of the total light emission from the city that is represented by the street lights. And we found that that's now only about somewhere like 15 or 20%. Whereas before, we think it was in excess of maybe 55% of the total light emissions. So we really did see a decrease in the street lighting contribution to the brightness of our night skies in the transition. And now this gives us concrete information about where to go next. And that means that we really need to start doing something about the private sources of lighting in the city, the parking lots that are lit all night, the signs and things like that. So having this evidence and getting it out there published was really important to be able to make the claim that not only had Tucson done the right thing in terms of changing its streetlights out, but also that that gave us important information on where we should focus our advocacy efforts next. So next, I'm going to talk briefly about the challenges that I think we face in the balance of this decade. If I had given this talk a couple of years ago, I would have talked about the border wall and a significant light that was beginning to go in both during the construction phase and even after segments of it were finished. I'm happy to report that obviously because of the change in administration that has essentially been halted. And so we're not seeing as much of a problem with light showing up on satellites like we were in 2017, 18, 19. So, needless to say, elections have consequences, and I'm confident in this case that it was something that was very useful for trying to limit the amount of new light that was going into some very ecologically sensitive locations along the border. What's coming next in this decade? Greenhouses. With legal cannabis in Arizona, this is a growth industry. There will be more of it in the future. We really don't have best practices yet for lighting design that can reduce situations like this one here in the CNN story from last year. The purple glow is because purple light turns out to be most effective for growing plants. They are reflecting all the green light anyway, so you don't even need it. We need some model policies that we can deploy in the counties in particular so that these don't become public nuisances and are creating vastly more light pollution than we really want to see in these parts of our state. Resource extraction is probably going to become important in the next decade before I hope it is replaced by more renewable sources of energy. This is an example from Chaco Culture National Historic Park in New Mexico, which is an IDA International Dark Sky Park. And that image that's animated over there on the left is showing indications of light from satellite measurements that are coming and going during these different years. And those are all gas and oil extraction operations in northwestern New Mexico. We don't have quite as much of that here in Arizona, but we have copper mines and other kinds of resource extraction that bring light to the ground. And these are real measurable effects. The images on the right show both scientific and just photographic measurements of light in the vicinity of Chaco that are the result of this resource extraction. So as time goes by, I think in the short run, we're going to see more of this resource extraction as energy prices go up, but hopefully over time, we will see less of it as we have more renewables. We should be a little worried about wind farms. Besides being an ecologically difficult thing for animals, there's a lot of light actually that comes in with those wind farms because they mandate that there's collision avoidance lights on wind turbines at night. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how to deal with that problem. But this bears worth watching in the next several years to see how this proceeds. And then I think we also just have to be cognizant of the growth that still is occurring in our community and has been for a long time, and manage that growth and the expectations that go along with it. So the graph on the left shows the rate at which the population in the Tucson metro area has grown in the last about 50 years. So more than 200% growth since 1970. And you would think that with all of that growth, there would have come a tremendous amount of new light and we would be dealing with this problem. But as it turns out, I think because of our extensive awareness among the public, our good light policies that we have in this area, and the influence of the astronomy enterprise, we've managed to avoid the worst of it. What I'm showing you on the right is a figure from another paper by Fabio Falchi's group that broke down the light emissions by US county. So this is a county level map, and it's showing the amount of light at night as a function of the population in each of those counties. So it's not where the light necessarily is, it's how the light is being consumed. And you'll notice that the most light consumption, the reds and the pinks tend to be mostly in the center and sort of the eastern part of the country. And on the coasts where they have more aggressive energy codes, in particular, the light consumption per capita is lower than it is in a lot of the rest of the country. And there we are in Pima County, Cochise County, Pinal. We're a bit below average. We're not consuming as much light per head of population as counties in other parts of the country are. And that's a good sign that we've been able to manage our growth pretty effectively and not bring a lot of new light consumption with that. So if we can hold the line there, if we can grow at a predictable rate, I think we'll be in good shape in coming decades. But again, this requires attention to this and vigilance as we grow so that we do so in a way that is sustainable for trying to keep what we have in the way of dark skies. So lastly, in the few minutes that I have left, I want to talk briefly about the issue of satellite light pollution that's on the minds of a lot of people in the astronomy community and really got the attention of the public in the last couple of years. And if you've been either out observing lately or you've watched the news, you've seen pictures like these and heard about astrophotographers complaining that they got Starlinked. These are both examples of images where trails due to objects in the SpaceX Starlink communications satellite constellation affected those images. They are seen most prominently in the few weeks after a new round of satellites is launched into orbit, generally when they're still all traveling together as a group, and their orbits are slowly being raised. But being closer to the Earth, they're highly reflective of sunlight. And the result is that we get these moving streaks, and there are just more and more of these all the time. Astronomers fortunately decided they were going to do something about this, and they got organized. And in the past 2 years, we've now held 4 workshops that have been put on by the U.S. National Science Foundation and the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. I was fortunate to have been involved in both of those major efforts. They've been making a lot of measurements and publishing them, trying to understand the nature of the problem and trying to keep this issue in the news cycle so that people outside of the astronomy community are aware of it. They understand the potential impact that it has to both ground-based and space-based astronomy. I should mention that some Starlink images or trails have been found in Hubble Space Telescope images. The good news is that James Webb is far enough away from Earth that it will not be affected by this, but Hubble remains a very productive facility, and we should be concerned about its impact in the era of Starlink. We have been in touch with the operators. SpaceX has actually been some very good partners in this. They have gotten their engineers on the problem. They've made some modifications to their spacecraft design and the orientation of the spacecraft as they go up to their final orbits to try to reduce the brightness of the objects. And that has proven to be a fruitful effort. We have seen a reduction in the brightness of Starlink objects, but they are not yet where we want them to be, which is below naked eye visibility. And even if we get there, they will still have an impact on astrophotography. So this is an issue that's wide open right now. There's not a great amount of regulation or oversight of this. Low Earth orbit is a bit of the Wild West right now. You might have seen in November the anti-satellite tests that the Russian Defense Ministry conducted. They blew up an old Soviet satellite and generated thousands of pieces of space debris that now threaten other objects in low Earth orbit. And just a few weeks ago, the Chinese government launched a complaint about the United States with the United Nations over the possibility that Starlink objects would pass so close to their Tiangong space station that they would have to take evasive action in order to protect their astronauts. So this is a geopolitical issue, and it's one that I'm sure is not going away. But I hesitate to speculate what might be next. You know, who knows? It's wide open. A lot of people are excited about projects like Starlink for the potential to bring broadband internet to rural areas that are underserved right now. But we also have to worry about a space environment that's so crowded that it might be detrimental or even fatal to the hardware and even people that are occupying that space. And we now have reason to believe that all these satellites are beginning to brighten the night sky. And we can't just drive to an out of sight observing or out of town observing site that's further away from the city to get away from this. because there's essentially nowhere on Earth except maybe around the poles that is immune to this issue. So the message is stay tuned. This is a rapidly evolving situation that affects us here, both in Arizona and beyond. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I hope this has been a useful overview and some reminders, even if you knew some of this information, and I will be glad to take your questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We did have some questions in the chat, but my chat just got erased. So I remember the first one, which was a lot of astronomers are concerned about light pollution and they develop some understanding of it. But how do they affect people that they know? How can we change the public's view of this?
I think that's an excellent question, and it is the question for the light pollution advocacy community. And I think it is correct to say that it won't be a battle that we win simply by changing the minds of elected officials. We're really going to have to change hearts and minds of people everywhere. And I think we do that through raising awareness of the issue and pointing out to people that there are benefits to dealing with the problem and solving it, and that we have those solutions. And when we choose those solutions, they are cost effective. They still do everything for us that we need in the way of the use of this light at night. And we can do these things without all the waste. That's really what we're asking people to do, is be aware of what they're using and think about how they use it carefully so as to avoid the waste. I would like to get people to where they think about light pollution in the same way that they would think about, leaving the lights on in their own home at night, or turning the thermostat up too high, or leaving the tap running and water just continuously dripping down into the sink. Or something that resonates with people here in the Southwest is the notion of people washing their cars and their driveways or watering grass lawns, and there's water running down the street. And we all recognize that as the waste of a resource that's precious to us, because we need it to survive in this environment. We have a long way to go yet before the average member of the public correlates those things in their mind. They understand that if they can't see the stars at night, it's because there's an important resource that's being wasted, and that they're moved to the point where they demand the change that will turn that situation around. So I think that is the question. And we've been working on this in different ways now for almost 35 years. And even if we get to the point that we get some of the results that we want to see, that we'll have to continue to educate future generations so that they continue to understand why this is important.
Great, thank you. We had a more specific question from Will, who says he has a neighbor, and I assume that he lives in Tucson, but he has a neighbor with who seems to emit an awful lot of light, but he doesn't know what to do about that. And so what is there, if you live in Tucson, that you might be able to do about this, or if you live some other place in Southern Arizona?
Will, that is the question we heard more often when I was at IDA than anything else. We got so many calls to the office that started off with, I have a neighbor with a porch light and I don't know what to do. And it's very frustrating, especially if you live in a city like Tucson, where our lighting is pretty good. I live in a neighborhood here, like many people do, that doesn't have any street lighting. And my neighborhood is nice and dark at night with just enough light to be able to see to get around. So if you have a neighbor who's got a very bright light on, it's annoying for one thing. It's a bit of a nuisance. But how do you confront that problem? I think that talking to people is still a worthwhile thing to do. More often than not, when people run into these issues, the offending party doesn't even mean to offend. They don't realize the effect that it's having on other people. They don't know that that light that's just blasting out in all directions is probably not helping in the way that they think that it does. They just put up lights because, well, it's what you do. You put a porch light on the exterior of your house. So it's a good opportunity to talk to people. I know this is a difficult time in our history where we're divided on a lot of topics and sometimes we avoid our neighbors, but this is a topic that I think a lot of people can really appreciate if it's brought to their attention. So maybe have a conversation with your neighbor if you know them or you feel comfortable approaching them. If it's not that kind of situation, there are provisions in our lighting ordinance that are meant to deal with this. You can try to bring it to the attention of code enforcement with the city of Tucson or wherever you might be. If your city has a lighting ordinance, talk to code enforcement and they might be able to contact the neighbor and remind them of what their obligations are under the law. What I think we probably don't want to do is come across as hostile or anything like that that's counterproductive. We want to try to keep this positive, raise awareness, educate where possible, show people the benefits of doing the right thing. And in my experience, more often than not, once you have brought that to their attention, they're more likely to say something like, I didn't have any idea. I'm sorry that I was creating this problem for you. And if you show them that there are these cost-effective solutions, there's a good chance that they might actually decide to do something about it. So good luck. I hope you're able to resolve your issue.
John, before I retired, I had a coworker who was a homeowners association manager down in, our president down in 3 Points. And they had someone just outside the development that had, basically it was a slump block building. It was a concrete block house. And he had virtually airplane landing lights in his backyard. There's probably nothing between him and Nogales, but desert. And he had the lights on, except they always reflected off of things, and it was just making life difficult in the HOA. So what they did was went to Pima County, and they had an enforcement group that came out. And so the problem was they called the guy first and said, we're going to be coming out and checking your lights. So they came out and the lights were off. And then the lights came on again. So they made a no notice inspection, had him go to court, but it took 90 days to get him to court. And then it was a $25, it was some really cheapo thing. So what he kept doing, it took them 3 years to get the lights off. But there was a Pima County enforcement group that was code enforcement group that would come out and do it, but they were not aggressive at first.
And is that Jim, by the way? I can't see you.
It's
Yeah,
Jim
it is Jim,
O'Connor.
sorry.
Jim, okay. I thought so. Jim, I'm glad you brought that up specifically because if you live in and around Tucson, it's really important to know what your jurisdiction is. If you are in city limits versus not in city limits. And the benefit to being around here is, as I mentioned earlier, that Tucson and Pima County by design have the same ordinance. So first of all, the same policy applies uniformly, whether you're in the city or in unincorporated Pima County. And that's really important at the margins of the city where the boundaries of the incorporated city of Tucson are very irregular in some cases. So if you're going to bring a complaint against a neighbor, it's important to know whether that should be addressed to the city or to the county. And I'm awfully sorry to hear about cases like that where it gets kind of ugly and people have to go to court. I do think that that's the exception rather than the rule, which is why I really encourage people to try talking this out first and see if you can't get some compliance that way, and look at things like legal action as being really a last resort, but also not be afraid to use that as a tool because the law is what it is. And, generally we should respect the law because it's the will of the people. Sometimes folks have difficulty following that, especially if it's not a very prominent or very necessarily popular law, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least give it a try.
Thank you, John. Linda on Facebook has a question of why so much light in the middle of the country and not so much on the coasts. Am I reading it backward?
So maybe, Linda, let me back up to that picture real quick to explain this a little bit better, perhaps. So what I'm showing you in this figure is not the quantity of light itself, but the amount of light that each person uses in those counties. So you take the total amount of light as seen by the satellite in a county and you divide it by its population. And that's why I think if you look at just the light itself, so if if I go back towards the beginning here and show you that map of the world again, this one, up here in North America, there's a lot of light on the West Coast, right? There's a lot of light on the East Coast and the Northeast around DC and New York and places like Florida. And this is for the US, mostly a map of where the people live. It follows population density pretty closely. But if I take that light, especially on those coasts, and then I divide by the population, it turns out that there are a lot more people who live in those areas than there is light being emitted, so that amount of light per person is relatively low. And so the coasts over here tend to be fairly blue, and that's a lower per capita consumption of light. But these very rural interior areas are high. Now, I do want to point out a couple of things that make this a little misleading, perhaps, and that's this pink area down here in West Texas, a similar pink area up here in Western North Dakota, and even a little bit down here south of San Antonio in Texas. The reason that those stand out as a high usage of light per capita is because really is production of gas. We're not even necessarily talking about electric light. Satellite is seeing a lot of light from flaring during oil production. And as a consequence, it looks artificially like people in those parts of the country are really consuming a lot of light. But just bear in mind that that's not necessarily electric light, and it relates very closely to the oil and gas industry in those parts of the country. So I hope that explains it a little bit better and why this map doesn't look quite like how you might think it should look.
Another question, Ray says, in 1998, I visited Paris, France. Nobody used auto lights at night. Street light provided more than adequate illumination, and I was never blinded by glare. A win-win.
It's a good point, Ray. And although I don't know if we would go to the extent of recommending that people in cities here were not using their headlights when they're driving at night. What's more important, I think, is the flip side of that. So think about an area where there's no street lighting and you're dependent upon your headlights to navigate. It turns out there's some research on this, and it suggests that until you get up to speeds of about 35 miles an hour, and it's sort of average traffic levels, your headlights do a much better job of showing you obstacles in the road and helping you avoid them than the overhead lighting does. It's only when you have high speeds. So think about, the interstate or higher traffic densities. So think about the main thoroughfares in a city like Tucson. That's where there is actual evidence that public safety is enhanced if you use street lighting. But if you're talking about residential neighborhoods where the speed limits are a lot lower and the traffic density is a lot lower, there really isn't a good justification for putting a street light on every residential street like they do, for example, north of us in the city of Phoenix, because your headlights are going to do a far better job at showing you those obstacles. So when we think about when we're planning out our cities, when we're renovating our cities, et cetera, if we decide to put in street lighting, we really ought to think about whether it has the public safety effect that I think we all just kind of assume that it does.
Thank you. Heidi has a comment that relates to the previous discussion, and she says, I was able to talk to a neighbor who had a floodlight pointing in my bedroom window. They had no idea and apologized and rotated the light down.
That's a great example of a win-win. And I'm sure, Heidi, it probably came back to your neighbor didn't even know that there was a problem. They didn't necessarily know that they were creating the situation for you. So I'm glad to hear that by talking it through with the neighbor that you were able to get a good result.
Yeah, they had no idea.
And Linda from Facebook has a comment, is the seminar about conserving energy in general or to help the satellites above?
So Linda, I would say that it's a bit of all of those things, that the fact that we can see this light from orbit with the satellites is a bit of a secondary concern. It's mainly something that's useful for us in understanding where the light is, especially in parts of the world where it may not be as easy to get to those areas. So again, think about, I was mentioning how on this figure right here, you have these areas that are seemingly involve a lot of light consumption because of oil and gas production. So we're really just using the satellite information as a way of telling us where the light is. But of course, this is really ultimately wrapped up in energy conservation. And that is true whether or not we're talking about these highly energy efficient LED lights or any other kind of lighting technology that might come in the future. We definitely want to reduce our energy consumption. We want to make things more energy efficient, and we want to provide enough light for people to see to do what they need to do at night. The main message is, if we use lighting better, if we use it more mindfully, that we'll find that we need less of it to get the job done. And so we will use less energy in the end. I think that's a benefit to people, to the planet, to wildlife, and there's really no downside in that.
Great. Heidi says that my issue is that it's too dark and dangerous to walk at night.
That's understandable, Heidi. The best thing that you could do in any such situation would be to bring your own light. I mean, having a headlamp or a flashlight is a really certain way to be sure that you won't fall victim to obstacles, right? You don't want to step off of a sidewalk into the street and take a fall or something like that. As to whether using streetlights is the best way to provide that versus people individually bringing their own lights with them, that's a matter that's open for debate. And, you know, there might be some places like your downtown areas where you expect that there are quite a few people that are out walking at night. Or green belts or hike and bike paths, that sort of thing, where you expect the presence of a lot of people. And it may just make a lot of sense from a community perspective to provide some light if it's done very carefully. But I think at the end of the day, it's really, you know, for your own safety, you really want to take that into your own hands. And one of the best ways to do that is just to bring enough light with you to do what you need to do. And then not have to worry about whether there's enough lighting around you in the environment to show you those obstacles.
The problem is that they're dangerous people that I can't see when they're far away. I can only see them when they get close, and they don't have a light. You know,
The point is taken.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, the point is taken.
As a woman, I can't walk at night around.
And I absolutely, I do not mean at all to downplay the fear that you might experience. It's real. It is absolutely real. And it's a bit mixed in terms of the evidence as far as whether using light has any influence on violent crime. I think there are certain circumstances where it definitely helps. And when it is installed for that purpose, I think the main thing is to make sure that you don't go overboard and put more light than is needed and maybe get into that situation where you have glare. It turns out for our detection of objects and people and things at low levels of light, like you would expect at night, it's really dependent on contrast. So what you want to see is the silhouette of the person against the lit background or vice versa. And I think what we could do is very careful and very well managed lighting design that really wouldn't contribute a lot of light pollution, but would really contribute to that sense of a feeling of safety. And if people feel safe, generally they tend to be more safe in those spaces. So I'm right there with you, Heidi. I wish that we could do our lighting design a little bit better in these public spaces, and that we could provide just enough light to do the job right and to provide that real sense of safety, and just to make sure that we're not going overboard in the process.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Thank you.
Will sends us a thank you for your response to his question. And Alan says, I think it is important to address parking lots that are lit all night long, in many cases with large floodlights.
I agree with you, Alan. I sort of suggested with the results that we got in the Tucson case that, whereas a generation ago, we would have been right in assuming that the biggest contributor to light pollution in most cities is street lighting. And now that here in Tucson that we have modernized our street lighting system to the point that it isn't really the main contributor anymore, that the next frontier is going to be those instances like you suggest, the parking lot where the lighting is on all night. Oftentimes that is done out of a belief that lighting an area will discourage criminal behavior. And that's especially true when the crime is property crime, like property theft. There is not a lot of scientific evidence that supports that. And in fact, there's some evidence that instead what that kind of light does is that it enables property thieves to do their business more effectively, so that by lighting these places, they might actually be creating the opposite of the desired effect. I have no problem with the notion of lighting a parking lot at times when people are coming and going. That's not only for safety, just being able to see to get around, but also for security. I do think that there is a beneficial effect for the right kind of lighting in those circumstances. And again, it comes back to that feeling of safety. If people are more confident when they head out into the parking lot at night, they will project that confidence. It makes them less likely to become the victims of violent crime.
Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of, in this case, I've seen a lot of empty parking lots lit up.
Yes.
I remember a particular one, a large parking lot of a Goodwill, which was right across from the Audubon Center, where I was setting up to do astronomy with some Audubon Society people. And they had these huge floodlights, nobody there, empty parking lot, no security issue, up way up on North Thornydale Road. And all they were doing was creating a huge light pollution problem for the Audubon Center at night, which would have been an ideal place to do astronomy normally. So,
and the solution for that, I think, is something that technology now enables, which is not just motion sensors, but proximity sensors, which are now beginning to be offered by some lighting manufacturers, that you can tell whether there are objects physically in the vicinity. So if somebody parks a car, for example, the lights can come on, whether or not there's motion, but if there's an object in that area. I think that could turn out to be the win-win. If the lights are on when people are present, but they're off when people are not present, not only does it potentially have a legitimate effect in discouraging crime, but it's a way of alerting law enforcement that something is up. If they know that ordinarily a parking lot is dark at night, but an officer comes by on a patrol and they notice that the parking lot is lit, that's the first indication that someone is there. Whether or not they're up to something no good is the next question you have to ask. But at least it's an indicator from a distance. And I think if we think that light can discourage certain kinds of criminal behavior, it's probably even more so the case when the person up to no good doesn't even know that the lighting is there and suddenly it comes on. So that's the kind of situation where I think technology is moving us in a direction that we can have that kind of element of surprise, and we can do it in a way that's cost effective for the property owner.
yeah, it would be great if that was required, and all, even like maybe dimming them later at night or turning them off after a certain hour when it's way past the business hours, for Goodwill, obviously.
And I want to remind people that John is going to be doing a breakout room later. So if you have discussions that you want to have with him later about, certain important topics, that will be a great time to talk more. Heidi suggested before that with a problem, like with a neighbor or something, you could bring in a mediator. And for people who are interested, she provided us a service by putting in an HTTP address for Tucson Mediators, which is a service in Tucson. So that's a great idea. Thank you, Heidi. Linda from Facebook says, how do you feel about solar lighting?
I'm a bit concerned about solar lighting, Linda, and the reason is if we're talking about bright lights, walkways, street lights, parking lots, etc., it enables the use of light where we otherwise would not see it because you don't have electricity. So what I think it might do is cause people to put up light in places that it's not even really needed, simply because they can do it at low cost. And again, the very high energy efficiency of LEDs is what is enabling that, because it simply takes much less electricity to run these things than in the past. And so in communities where this is starting to go in, which tend to be more rural communities, I do caution people to keep an eye on that. They may want to address it in their lighting codes. But for as much of a benefit as it might be, especially to people in the developing world, to have the light that they need, we just need to be careful, like with all lighting, that we don't go too far in a particular direction.
And we wanted to let you know, John, that we have been having 28 people on Facebook tonight, and we have had numerous thank yous come in from Facebook. So.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for being here tonight.
Yes, exactly. We love it when people come on Facebook and can benefit from our meetings. Ray says, I like a lot of the discussion pointing use light where and when you need it. Use of light where and when you need it, which is an excellent theme if we could all remember that. Yes. Author from Facebook says, in my neighborhood, I think the biggest light offenders think that the light offers safety. I don't think this is true, as the lights tend to blind you in any area that is no light. Oh my goodness, I lost my words here.
Well, just to comment on that briefly, there's truth in that. I think in the end, most people are afraid of the dark. Even as adults, we're afraid of the dark. It can be a scary place. It's one where, we lose a bit of control over our environment because we can't see what's happening. Not to say that there aren't true threats out there at night, but that goes back to this notion of using light very carefully, very deliberately, very intentionally, so that we put it in those places that are most likely to help us see better, so that we have better visibility, and therefore contributes to lowering some of that anxiety about being in outdoor spaces at night. So none of this ever, it means that we have to get rid of all the light. That's sometimes something that people think, is that when we talk about light pollution, they say, well, here they are again, coming to take away all of our lights. And, I've never believed that solving this problem means making the world go completely dark. It's not a very pragmatic way of addressing the problem. And it's back to that notion of, let's just do the right thing. Let's put it in the places and times and amounts and times of night that are needed, and try not to depend so much on it otherwise. And I think a lot of that anxiety about darkness begins to go away.
So yes, one of the reasons Arthur was discussing this is that he was concerned about how he might convince people that the lights don't detract crime, and that it does seem that many people are very resistant to that idea.
The more people who spend more time outside at night and experience these situations firsthand, I think they gradually learn more from intuition. And if there's one thing that I would do in trying to educate more people about this, is to try to get them outside at night, get them comfortable with lower light levels. Let them see, for example, how well you can see the landscape around you under the light of a full moon, which is a tiny amount of light compared to most installations of electric lighting, but it's perfectly adequate to navigate. Because we've lost our connection with nature, we spend so much of our time indoors, especially at night, we just don't have an intuitive sense of how bright those sources of light, even in nature, are anymore.
Stiblina says, given that street lights are now a small percentage of the problem, how do we move to the next step on private lighting?
Sabrina, that is one of the toughest questions that we face, because it's relatively easy to deal with street lighting, and that's usually because it's the municipality that owns it, or it's an electrical utility company that owns it. You're just dealing with one entity. When we talk about private lighting, there are a million property owners out there, and if we have to go through this process one by one, it's going to take a really long time. I am a believer in the power of the law, not in a way that is meant to hit people, bringing enough attention to where you get enough people who want to see the problem solved, realize, agree on a set of rules. And the rules then in turn relate to the way that we use light. What are the actual practices of lighting? And that we write those into laws so that everybody understands what the rules are, they know what the expectations are, and hopefully over time we can begin to get a lid on this problem. So for now, I think it's a combination of those things. It's direct advocacy, it's engaging with our neighbors, it's talking about this issue, it's raising the issue with groups of people that may have never heard about it before, in the hopes that they'll want to know more about it. And eventually, as we climb that hill of awareness, I hope we eventually get to sort of a critical mass where enough people recognize that a problem exists, they want to see the problem solved, and then we're ready to come in with the suggestions for how they can do that effectively.
Thank you. Jim Knoll, by the way, has placed a link for the lighting code in the chat for anyone who would like to access that. And Heidi says the lighting in the Walmart parking lot at Elcon is really great. Almost too dim, but not quite.
I know the exact parking lot you're talking about, Heidi, and that the first time I saw it, I had the same impression. It's so dim that at first you think this has to be unsafe. But if you give your eyes a moment to adjust, you'll notice that that lighting is really exemplary. And a few years ago at IDA, we had a contact with Walmart's corporate, and I brought that up to them and I said, your store at Elcon is so wonderful. Why can't you do this throughout your chain of stores everywhere in the country? And what I heard from them was not unexpected, which is they say, well, you know, we tend to design for whatever the local rules are. We're going to follow the local ordinance. And I was trying to nudge them in the direction of doing this everywhere just voluntarily. But that specific example is Walmart's reaction to the demands of the Tucson outdoor lighting code. And I think they even went above and beyond their city's expectations.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. But we should share that wherever we can so that we can give them credit for that. Heidi also says that there is a wonderful book that's Brilliant: The Evolution of Artificial Light by Jane Brox.
I'm not familiar with that one, so thank you for the recommendation.
Yes, well, I'll have to look into that. Okay, and then we have Ray says, as professional astronomers move to L3, will we lose their advocacy? Or L2, will we lose their advocacy?
I've been concerned about that, Ray, for a long time now, and it was going on even before James Webb. It was going on even somewhat before the Hubble Space Telescope. My concern is that as time goes by and more astronomers are getting their data primarily from space-based observatories or data archives. Remember that projects like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and the Vera Rubin Observatory that's coming next produce tremendous amounts of data, and it will take years or decades or longer to extract all of the scientific information from those archives. That means fewer astronomers around telescopes at observatories at night to where they can see these direct effects. And some people who primarily use spacecraft data might say, I don't have to worry about light pollution at all because my data come from the web and it's well beyond the influence of Earth and its satellites. And when I talk to people like that, I remind them, you know, it may not directly impact your scientific research, but for many of these folks, especially if they are faculty members, say at smaller colleges, they're the only astronomer maybe in their community. They are the one influence on this topic that might be in that community. And they have such power to do good, not just for their profession, but for this thing that we all say that we love, which is astronomy in the night sky. So I really encourage them to think beyond just their immediate professional needs and recognize that there's a world of people out there who are hungering for this topic. They want to know more about it. They love the cosmos and the night sky, and they really want to see that protected, I think, at the end of the day. And so I still hope that we can turn a lot of those professional astronomers into advocates, even if, you know, what they really want now is Webb telescope data.
Right. Okay, thank you so much, John. I think we're going to give your voice a break for a bit now, and we'll do a couple of other things, and then we'll do the breakout rooms. And so people will get to talk to you even more, and I'm sure they'll enjoy that a lot. But just thank you so much for your contributions tonight. And obviously people really enjoyed it a lot. So
it was my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so we'll see you in a little bit. And what we're at this point going to say bye to our Facebook people. And we very much appreciate your joining us on Facebook tonight. We hope that you will go to our website further and use the website. There is the ability on that website to join the club, and we would love it if you join TAAA. We would love it also if you come back to join us at other member meeting presentations the first Friday night of the month, of every month. The first Friday night is our meeting. And of course, anytime anybody wants to donate to the club, we appreciate that. So thank you so much for your interest in TAAA and in astronomy. And we hope that you will continue to be interested and continue to join us further. So thank you. Okay, now tonight for the member part of the meeting, we have Doug Smith. Doug, yes, there you are, Doug. If you can unmute, and I think you have an award to present.
I have a bunch,
Okay.
as it turns out. First of all,